So Ezra Pound is contemporary of T.S. Eliot, another American poet, who moves to Europe. He lives in Paris and London, namely. He later ends up living in Italy. Strangely, I'm telling you, the end of the story is he becomes involved with Mussolini. uh, he ends up. I don't want to give you the biography of his life, but he ends up in he has a real problem. He has a lot of anti-Semitic writings. It becomes a delicate thing when he gets, especially as he gets older. But Ezra Pound, a great linguist in this fact that he studied. For just to give you an example of what he did, he wrote a lot of his early poems are translations and sort of adaptations of the troubadours. So we're talking about like 12th century, 13th century, poetry written in ancient French, and he knew the ancient French. He was actually a master of Dante. So we're talking about, high, the end of the Middle Ages, Florentine dialects. He knew old, amongst other things. He was a great linguist, and he spoke, obviously could read Greek and Latin, and he had a real feel for old French poetry. So he wrote these, just to give you an example, he wrote these sort of adaptations of the troubadours, and when you read them, they're very impressive. In as far as that, you really enter into a spirit that that is foreign to us, right? Yes, they're kind of fictions, but we feel that he has really tried to render. There's something kind of, I almost want to say, exposed, or there's something kind of brusque and forceful in his language, that instead of kind of smoothing over the language, and like someone like Tennyson, he wants all this sort of abruptness and sort of the forcefulness of the lifestyle and the sort of mentality, we could say, of the troubadour poets to stick through. And read these are in personae. I included personae here, and strangely, just to give another idea of the sort of the I would say the breadth. I mean, when his younger works, I find phenomenal, literally just phenomenal. And also in personae, for example, Ezra Pound also got very interested in Chinese poetry, and he tried to come up with a way to give the force of an ideogram. We know that Apollinaire has done this too, right? But he really tried to make his language have this kind of an impact. So he wrote these really, we're familiar with the people writing haiku poetry. We've had sort of like, I would say in French we have like Paul Claudel. He writes like les sons vers pour éventail, right? But to be honest, they really lack the force that Ezra Pound's Chinese poetry last. And they have this really, he captures a lot of the humor, a lot of the strange grace, so they're just astounding works. For example, I mean, they sort of, I guess the humor, and he sort of is faithful to a sort of a very almost awkward way of putting words together. It's a strange kind of a grace, right? For example, he talks about he's right. He was very involved. He was actually enamored with Confucius, so he writes these verses about sort of these sort of dialogues involving Confucius and his disciples, and then he'll write about a character who dies, and he says he died of alcohol. He has these sort of strange formulations that are almost foreign, but they are almost retranscribed into English, and they have this really forceful impact. But anyway, just all this to say that Ezra Pound, when he moved to Europe, he actually went and sought out Yeats, right, who we just talked about, in Ireland, and he lived with him, I think near the south of Ireland, near Galway, I think, for almost a year. and they worked together, and sort of wrote in. Not, I don't know if writing together isn't exactly, but they sort of, we could say they kind of worked together and wrote and studied together. And then he came and was very close with T.S. Eliot when he was living in London and in Paris, and he actually the first draft of the Wasteland, he was very critical of it, and he said that T.S. Eliot really needed to make his language more. I'm trying to think of how to describe this. More jagged, right? A little bit more forceful, right? And so it's very interesting to study the first drafts of the Wasteland to the latter drafts. So this maybe gives you an idea of what's going on here with here we're talking about really high modernism, right? We're talking about these extremely cultured people. I mean, when you really think about Ezra Pound, I mean, it's great reading. I mean, it's very unfortunate that he turned out to be a fascist later in life, but well, what can you do? It's pretty crazy actually. But when you read his, I mean, the fact that he could really capture the spirit, I think, the way no one has, of French troubadour poetry, Confucius, haiku, Dante. Later when he writes the cantos, it's sort of almost like the response to the Divine Comedy. Impressive, right? But also strange. So we once again get this feeling that, and also extremely relevant to notice. By the way, we can think a lot of these things are kind of a reaction to World War I. This is sort of the old world has come to a halt. But we can think of things in, let's say, in France, such as, I would say that the other major currents that we should probably be aware of is sort of Dada and Surrealism, right? This is a real Dada and Surrealism, with like Tristan Tzara and people like André Breton, is a real reaction. We can think of them as being punks to, what destruction civilization, or if you prefer capitalist civilization, leads to, right? And their writing really reflects this. So you might want to think about in these terms. This is sort of one of the first times that poetry is kind of explodes, right? In the sense that the form of the poetry itself explodes. It's really hard to read. You don't really understand much all the time. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. The poets are really asking questions about, why do you want to write poetry, right? And it is very relevant this time. So now, very quickly, I'm going to go much more quickly because I don't want to ramble about this for hours, but I just want to give you means to get into this stuff, right? So notice here we're talking about sort of Europe. Here we're talking about, the Irish, Irish, and it's hard to say if it's a branch of English poetry, English literature or not. We're talking about sort of now we're talking about the Americans. Now you're aware that we have a lot of Americans in Europe, so we're talking about T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. Now it's good to think of the Americans who don't leave Europe, right? We have William Carlos Williams. You might want to read it. I forgot to include. I could have there's others I could include. E. Cummings and William Carlos Williams, who remain in the U.S. and they adopt. I would say they really work on short forms, very compact, very, I would say, sensual, and I would say sort of broken forms of poetry that are extremely sensual, difficult stuff, really kind of dense and forceful. It's interesting to say that I would say William Carlos Williams is what I'm saying. That's actually more E. Cummings. When I talk about E. Cummings, he has more of a sort of there's a little bit more rupture involved. Now William Carlos Williams, he wrote very short poetry with very kind of vivid imagery, but he didn't quite. It remains lyrical, even though it's short. What's interesting about it, at least to me, is that there's a lot of didn't have the chance to talk about Walt Whitman. If you read, I have Alcaquere. You can kind of do as you like. You can kind of just rummage through whatever poetry of what William Carlos Williams you like. But there is a strain, even though it's very short. What's interesting in William Carlos Williams, even though his poetry is very short, it's very kind of breathy and ample, and there is still, just like Yeats, it's very strong lyrical strain, very kind of musical, and I really hear echoes of Walt Whitman, who I wanted to talk about, because we talked about the fact that, in 19th century English poetry, we have this idea that we're in a very clubby atmosphere, and we could say with Whitman we have someone writing more about everyday man in the city. There is this question of his voice, whether it is sort of the voice of everyone, or even though it's an extremely unique voice. But it's also very, we have his Leaves of Grass, we have, really longer verse forms, right? Okay. We have sort of this ample flowing, we're swept away by Walt Whitman's verse, right? These are very ample, generous, democratic, full verse, right? And it's really interesting to see how William Carlos Williams, who stays in the U.S., he kind of retains this sort of, and we get the feeling it's sort of like there's a sort of a freshness of the Republic at this time. But in the 19th century, wealth inequality, if you read someone like Thomas Piketty, was less pronounced in the U.S. than it was in Europe at this time, right? So we do get the feeling that we have sort of like this native grand democratic grandeur there are sort of noble tones to this. You don't have to believe that that's really what it is, and you might be very critical, but rightly so. But William Carlos Williams, he was actually from Rutherford, New Jersey. He I think it was his mother was from South America, and he was a doctor, and he was sort of like middle class, but still of somewhat sort of he had a humble profession. He took care of people. Today that's very relevant, right? And he wrote a lot about sort of he really vividly portrays sort of, I would say, small middle class towns, in sort of middle America. We have this feel to it, right? And yet very at the same time, he's influenced by what we call the Imagists, just like the other one we have here right below him, Marianne Moore. She is an example of what we call the Imagist poetry, where we have very short verse that is very the sort of broken up syntax, and that are supposed to really have vivid images, and we get this. I feel like the imagery is very similar. And you can find this also in Marianne Moore. I mean, notice we introduced the first of these little installments. We were talking about Marianne Moore. She's saying, "I too dislike it." So we do get the feeling that we have a hard brain going on here, right? We have hard, crisp images, critical of the whole poetical enterprise, and there's a certain crispness, right? We're not asleep, right? Lastly, I'd like to move on to two great women poets. So I think her perhaps less. No, I'm probably wrong. I'm not sure. I get the feeling that they're not studied maybe as much as they could be. We have a sort of let's look at the example of Edna St. Vincent Millay, and I talked about Edmund Wilson. If you want to be entertained, you read an essay by Edmund Wilson. He knew her he was actually in love. It's really funny. Halfway through the essay by Edmund Wilson on Edna St. Vincent Millay, he talks about the fact that he asked her to marry him, and she said no. It's really interesting. So once again, it's good to get this kind of gossipy. Brings a lot of this stuff to life. Got this sort of gossipy content, right? But she's very gutsy. She wrote sonnets, and she was very. Shakespeare has a very. We get the feeling that he's very kind of sensual and materialistic, and materialistic in the way that we get the feeling he's really rendering juiciness. The juice of life is really in there, and Edna St. Vincent Millay, who is from Maine, right? Who is from New England, and she was brought up in a family. I think of her a lot of, I think I'm not sure exclusively sisters, but in a household run by sort of hard-headed women who lived in the country who read a lot of Shakespeare, and she writes really. But then she ended up moving to New York, and she became sort of like the darling of I would say the New York kind of poetry scene, if that makes any sense, in Greenwich Village, and so she was kind of trendy, and she writes. I would say sort of gutsy. The fiber of her verse is really gutsy, and it was there. It's very lively, right? There's a lot of spunk to it, right? And she didn't really care as much about movements, I would say, but she was sort of a spunky writer that was lively. I mean, that's unfair because there's a lot more that you could say about it, but that's something you might want to. She's a good expression of sort of. I would say spark. For example, she talks about the fact that she says why did I was it really for this? She said was it when I was younger, then I was all full of fire. Was it for this that I said noble? Was it for this that I would say domesticated as a plate I should retire at 8:30? So we have this feeling of like almost she can express rage and determination. If you really want to read that kind of poetry, check that out. And then also I would want to remind you of also Dorothy Parker, who is a real wit. She's really funny. She actually writes really good short stories too. She writes a lot of light verse. There's sort of. There's actually a really good the Penguin edition of her collected works. I told you about this deluxe edition where you have a comic book writers illustrate the covers. There's a really good edition, and you have the stories, and then it's punctuated by the collections of her poems. And the poems are one of the collections. The first one is Enough Rope, and then we have Sunset Guns, which are listed here, and you'll find that these are. They're really, once again, they're really spunky and they're really funny. They're really, and it's good that it's important to note that we have she's a real wit. She was sort of a socialist. I would say socialist actually in two ways. She was a socialite, I should say. She hung out at this place called the Algonquin Club and had cocktails, and she wanted to have sort of like a salon, but she wasn't. You could say that she was a snob, but she actually later became she became involved in the communist movement, and she wasn't at all in a sort of salon atmosphere detached from everyday life. She was a socialite, but there's a story that is called Big Blonde, and it talks about the hard comings of an aging woman who drinks too much. It's and it's full of it's gutsy, right? Once again, it's gutsy, but it's interesting to know she keep the wit and the lightness, right? So it's an interesting take on sort of society verse, and I think that's worth not forgetting that a lot of times I got very involved in these discussions of high modernist poetry, and once again it's very often masculine. The tradition of light verse, it's important that remains, and that is another dimension that has a tendency that it can kind of disappear when poetry gets too serious, right? And that's once again this idea that's an aspect of life that is that can kind of fall by the wayside. So you might want to check that out. Worth reading, fun. I'm trying to give you stuff that I think is fun. So that's the end of this. This installation was sort of about modernism and relevance, and the idea would be, I think, that this is, I'll just say in my opinion that this is a real high point for what's going on at this period in poetry. It's a real high point. Everything going on here, and the relevance. This poetry was very relevant. It's hard to say that it really is today. A lot of it's written by these people are less professorish than than we are, right? So it can be more exciting. It might be a way for you to get into it. And once again, even if you don't write poetry, think about that. Read poetry and say, I'm not going to write poetry. Maybe, that might be something to think about. How you read, how you write. Hopefully, it'll wake you up. So, optional. You don't have to read any of this if you don't want to. So take care. We'll be finishing this installation. We're going to look a little bit more towards stuff that's a little bit more contemporary next week, and then we'll move away from poetry altogether. Take care.